It was a morning of deceptive serenity in the village of St. Mary Mead. The sun shone kindly upon the ivy-clad cottages, smoke curled lazily from the chimneys, and the church bell chimed the half-hour in its measured, contented fashion. In the lane, a milk cart rattled past, and two village women exchanged cheerful gossip across a low hedge, their conversation revolving, as it so often did, around the doings of others. At first glance, all appeared as it always had, orderly, peaceful, and entirely unremarkable. Yet beneath that tranquil surface, a whisper of unease had begun to circulate. One could hear it in the subdued voices at the post office, in the discreet glances exchanged over cups of tea in the Blue Boar, and in the faintly scandalized tone of Mrs. Price Ridley as she declared to anyone who would listen that she had never, in all her days, heard of such a thing. For quite astonishingly, Lady Bantry of Gossington Hall, the elegant, dignified widow of the late Colonel Bantry, had been summoned to appear in court, not as a witness, nor as a complainant, but as a defendant. The charge, though delicately phrased in official terms, was of the most dreadful kind imaginable in a place like St. Mary Mead. A death had occurred at Gossington Hall, and it was no accident. Miss Jane Marple, sitting in her neat little parlour on the High Street, was engaged that morning in the rather soothing occupation of sorting her embroidery silks. She had, of course, heard the rumours. Everyone had. Her maid, the talkative and excitable Cherry, had rushed in not an hour ago with the latest version that Lady Bantry had poisoned a guest over dinner, that the police had come in the night, that even Inspector Craddock had been seen arriving from London. Miss Marple, however, had listened with her usual mild expression of polite interest, merely remarking that people did sometimes exaggerate when excited. Still, as she wound a length of pale blue silk round its card, her mind was quietly turning over the matter. Lady Bantry was not only a neighbour but an old friend. She was a woman of good breeding, quick intelligence, and not at all inclined to dramatics. That she should be implicated in anything as distasteful as a death, let alone a criminal charge, was quite unthinkable. And yet Miss Marple knew, better than most, that evil and folly did not always appear in their expected guises. Sometimes they crept softly into drawing-rooms with the scent of lavender and sherry, smiling all the while. She rose and moved to the window. The garden outside glowed with late summer colour, delphiniums, roses, and sweet peas, all seemingly unaware of the turmoil brewing beyond their tidy hedges. A small figure in a straw hat passed by the gate. Miss Hartnell, no doubt on her way to the butcher. Miss Marple gave a little sigh. She could almost feel the buzz of curiosity sweeping through the village. Lady Bantry in the dock. It would set tongues wagging for weeks. By 11 o'clock, Miss Marple had decided, very sensibly, that a short visit to Gossington Hall might be in order. Officially, it would be a call of sympathy and friendship. Unofficially, it might help her discern what had truly occurred. Gossington Hall stood about a mile from the village, a gracious Georgian house surrounded by lawns, oak trees, and an air of gentle decay. The Bantrys had once entertained lavishly, but since the Colonel's death, the grand rooms had fallen into a kind of genteel quietude. Lady Bantry lived there with a few servants, her companion Mrs. Hargreaves, and her memories. When Miss Marple arrived, the butler, an elderly man named Pritchard, opened the door with a gravity appropriate to the occasion. "Good morning, Pritchard," said Miss Marple kindly. "I hope her ladyship is in." Pritchard hesitated. "Her ladyship is somewhat indisposed, Miss Marple. The events of yesterday have quite unsettled her, but I believe she would wish to see you." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I shall not keep her long." She was shown into the morning room, where Lady Bantry sat by the window, a half-drunk cup of tea before her and a small terrier asleep at her feet. Her usually composed face bore traces of sleeplessness and distress, though she managed a faint smile on seeing her friend. "My dear Jane," she said, "you must think the whole thing absurd, and so it is. But I assure you it's perfectly true. The police have actually charged me." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I came as soon as I heard, dear. It's dreadful business, and I can only imagine what you must be feeling." Lady Bantry gave a small, helpless laugh. "Feeling? I hardly know what to feel. Shocked, of course. Angry, frightened, though I scarcely dare admit it. To think of my name, the Bantry name, appearing in the newspapers, and all over that wretched dinner party. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. Perhaps you might tell me everything quietly from the beginning. Lady Bantry nodded. Yes, perhaps it will do me good to speak of it. She took a deep breath. It was last Thursday evening. I'd invited a small party to dinner, nothing grand. Just the vicar and his wife, Colonel Melchett, Miss Diana Fallows, and Mr. Edmund Cotterill. He's a distant cousin of my late husband, recently back from India. He's been staying here a fortnight. Miss Marple gave a small, encouraging nod. I see. The evening went perfectly well, until dessert, that is. We just finished the port and were about to move to the drawing room when Mr. Cotterill complained of feeling faint. Within minutes, he collapsed. Dr. Haydock was sent for, but it was quite useless. The poor man was gone before the ambulance arrived. There was a pause. The clock ticked softly on the mantelpiece. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her mind was already quietly sifting through possibilities. Lady Bantry continued, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Haydock believed it was a seizure at first, but the next day the police arrived with the most dreadful news. They'd found traces of digitalis in his wineglass. They say he was poisoned and that I must have administered it. Miss Marple looked at her friend gently. And did you pour the wine yourself? No, that's the ridiculous part. Pritchard served it, as always. But they say the bottle was opened in the kitchen and brought in already decanted. And as the hostess, I am, apparently, responsible for everything that happens in my own house. She gave a short, mirthless laugh. They even took away the decanter and the wine glasses for testing. Oh, Jane, I have never in my life handled poison. Miss Marple said softly, digitalis is not easy to come by, unless one knows something of medicine or gardening. Lady Bantry gave a start. Gardening. Yes, said Miss Marple. Foxglove, digitalis purpurea, grows quite commonly in the countryside. Its leaves, improperly used, are deadly. Lady Bantry stared at her. You mean someone could have made it themselves? It is possible, Miss Marple murmured, though it requires some knowledge and a certain intention. Lady Bantry leaned back, pale. They think it was I, because of the will. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. The will. Yes, apparently, Mr. Cotterill had made a new will only a few days before his death, leaving me a rather substantial sum. I hadn't the faintest idea until the solicitor told the police. Miss Marple's knitting mind moved with quiet precision. A motive conveniently discovered, she thought. How neat, perhaps too neat. After a pause, she said gently, who knew of this new will, do you suppose? Only his solicitor, Mr. Clegg, and possibly Miss Fallows. She's his cousin too, and rather attentive, if you understand me. Indeed, said Miss Marple mildly, and who was present when the wine was poured? Pritchard, of course. Then there's Mrs. Hargreaves, my companion. She was helping in the dining room because the maid was off with influenza. And Colonel Melchett sat nearest to the decanter, I think. The vicar was on my other side. Miss Marple nodded slowly, a rather interesting mixture of company. Indeed, and now the newspapers will have their field day, society widow accused of murder. Oh, Jane, how shall I ever face the Women's Institute again? Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. My dear Dolly, you must not think of that. The truth will come out, it always does, you know, and you may be quite certain that I, at least, have no doubt of your innocence. Lady Bantry gave her a trembling smile. You are very good, Jane. I only hope the magistrates will feel the same. Miss Marple rose presently, promising to return soon. As she walked back towards the village, she allowed her thoughts to wander freely. She knew most of the people concerned, or had at least observed them from a distance. Miss Diana Fallows, for instance, was a handsome woman of 30, with an eye for opportunity and a history of failed engagements. Colonel Melchett, the retired soldier, was loyal but quick-tempered. The vicar and his wife were kindly, though the latter was known for her nervous chatter. And Mrs. Hargreaves, well, Mrs. Hargreaves was something of an enigma, former governess, companion, and, according to village whispers, quite indispensable to Lady Bantry. Digitalis, murmured Miss Marple softly to herself as she reached her gate. A rather old-fashioned poison and very subtle. No taste, no smell. One must know what one is about. She smiled faintly, and whoever did it certainly does know. The church clock struck noon as she went inside, the sound echoing over the quiet rooftops of St. Mary Mead. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed and a dog barked. But to Miss Marple's perceptive mind, the village had already taken on that peculiar stillness which precedes a storm, when every whisper holds a secret and every friendly smile conceals a question. Miss Marple was not, by nature, a meddlesome woman, at least, not in her own estimation. She simply had a curiosity about human nature, sharpened by long experience and a quiet conviction that one could learn more by listening than by speaking. And so, when the whole of St. Mary Mead began to buzz like a disturbed hive over Lady Bantry's predicament, Miss Marple went about her days as usual, knitting peacefully, tending her garden, and observing with that deceptively mild blue gaze which missed nothing. The first order of business, of course, was to discover what really had happened that fateful evening at Gossington Hall, and Miss Marple, with her delicate sense of propriety, knew better than to call upon the police for assistance. No, she would rely instead on her friends, her acquaintances, and the inexhaustible flow of village conversation. It began, as such things often did, in the tea shop. The Blue Boar tea rooms were the very heart of St. Mary Mead gossip, a place where scandal and speculation were served as promptly as tea and scones. On the morning after her visit to Lady Bantry, Miss Marple took her customary seat by the window and ordered a modest pot of Darjeeling. She was soon joined by Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell, both visibly aglow with the delicious excitement of the latest developments. "My dear Miss Marple," began Mrs. Price Ridley in her usual breathless manner, "have you heard? They say the inquest is to be held next Monday, and that the coroner has already hinted at something most incriminating. Poor Lady Bantry, such a shock to society." Miss Hartnell nodded vigorously. "Quite dreadful, of course, but between you and me, I've never trusted that Mrs. Hargreaves. There's something sly about her, and those spectacles, people who peer like that are always hiding something, I say." Miss Marple stirred her tea with perfect composure. "I dare say," she murmured, "and yet Mrs. Hargreaves has been with Lady Bantry for nearly 10 years, hasn't she? That speaks of a certain loyalty." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "Or convenience. I've heard she manages everything at Gossington Hall now, bills, letters, guests, even the household accounts. Why, if there were poison in the kitchen, she'd have known before anyone." "Poison is such a nasty thing," Miss Hartnell declared darkly. "I can't abide the thought of it. Makes one afraid to touch a cup of tea in a strange house." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, but poison, you know, requires both knowledge and access. That combination narrows one's possibilities considerably." The two ladies blinked at her, as if she had spoken in some foreign tongue, and promptly turned the conversation to whether Lady Bantry's hat at the flower show last month had been appropriate for a widow. Miss Marple, having gathered all that was useful, sipped her tea and let their chatter fade pleasantly into the background. Her mind, however, was quietly assembling a list. Mrs. Hargreaves, Colonel Melchett, Miss Fallows, the vicar, Mrs. Clement, and of course, the loyal Pritchard. 6 people, each with opportunity and perhaps motive. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Inspector Craddock himself. Miss Marple, greeting him at her door, looked both surprised and amused. "My dear Inspector, how very nice to see you again, though I rather wish it were under more cheerful circumstances." Craddock smiled wryly. "You'll have guessed, of course, that I'm here about Lady Bantry." "I had rather thought so," said Miss Marple mildly, leading him to her parlour. "You'll take a cup of tea, won't you? I've some excellent seed cake." "Thank you, you're very kind." He sat, balancing his notebook on one knee. "You know the lady well, I gather." "Oh yes, since she first came to Gossington, in fact. A very practical woman, with a good heart and rather a sharp tongue, not at all the sort to indulge in melodrama." Craddock nodded, scribbling. "And yet here we are. Digitalis poisoning, very neat, very deliberate. You wouldn't, by any chance, have an idea who might want to frame her?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I never have ideas, Inspector, only observations. But it seems to me that whoever planned this knew exactly how things would appear. That is always the mark of a clever criminal. Craddock leaned back. We've found that the digitalis came from the hall's garden. There's a clump of foxglove near the greenhouse, dried leaves missing from several stems. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Ah, yes, the old herb border. I remember it well, but anyone might have walked through the garden, I suppose. That's what we're trying to determine. The servants' quarters are near the back path, and there's a side gate often left unlatched. Still, it would have taken some nerve to prepare the poison and slip it into the wine. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. It would indeed, unless, of course, one had reason to be in the dining room or to serve. Exactly, said Craddock. That's why Mrs. Hargreaves is under a bit of scrutiny. She handled the decanter before dinner, claimed she wiped it for fingerprints after polishing the silver. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. How conscientious of her. Craddock chuckled grimly. Quite. Between ourselves, she seems the capable type who might manage anything, including a murder. Miss Marple looked into her teacup for a moment. Capability is a double-edged thing, Inspector. In some women, it's born of necessity, not wickedness. One must always ask why before one asks how. He regarded her with reluctant admiration. You know, Miss Marple, half my men would solve crimes faster if they listened to you. She smiled serenely. I expect they'd be quite bored if they did. Crime, after all, is only human nature showing itself in rather unpleasant ways. That evening, Miss Marple sat before her fire, knitting yet another small blue baby's jacket for the vicar's grandchild, and turning the matter quietly over in her mind. Something about the case troubled her, not merely Lady Bantry's situation, but its simplicity. Things that looked too tidy, she had often observed, rarely were. The will was certainly suspicious, but the timing, only a few days before the death, was almost too perfect. And why should Mr. Cotterill, recently returned from India, leave such a sum to a distant relative by marriage, sentiment, gratitude, or guilt? She decided to pay a visit the next day to the vicarage. Mr. Clement, a thoughtful man with a fondness for puzzles, had been at the dinner, and Miss Marple trusted his recollections to be both accurate and uncolored by gossip. The Reverend Clement received her warmly in his study, a book-lined room faintly scented with pipe tobacco. His wife, the nervous but kind-hearted Griselda, fluttered in with a tray of tea and biscuits, insisting that Miss Marple have at least two. Dreadful business, isn't it? Griselda exclaimed. Poor Lady Bantry, I simply can't believe it, and yet the police say they've proof. I don't see how they could. Miss Marple smiled reassuringly. Proof can be a tricky thing, my dear. Sometimes it proves only what one expects to find. Mr. Clement looked thoughtful. The evening seemed perfectly ordinary. Cotterill was in good spirits, spoke a great deal about India, you know, tigers and temples and the like, ate heartily too. Then, just after dessert, he turned pale and slumped forward. Melchett shouted for water, and poor Lady Bantry rang for the doctor at once. There was nothing anyone could do. Miss Marple asked quietly, Did you notice anything unusual about the wine? Not particularly. It was a decent port, I think, though Melchett commented that it tasted slightly bitter, but he'd already had a glass or two of sherry beforehand. And who poured it? Pritchard did the first round, then Mrs. Hargreaves passed the decanter. Cotterill helped himself, as I recall. He joked about English wine being too mild after Indian brandy. Miss Marple nodded, and Miss Fallows. She barely touched hers, said it gave her headaches. I remember because she spilled a drop on the tablecloth and fussed dreadfully about it. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. Interesting. Griselda leaned forward, wide-eyed. Do you think she might know something, Miss Marple? I think, said Miss Marple gently, that people reveal a great deal when they fuss, especially when they have something else on their minds. As she walked home through the twilight, Miss Marple reflected that the threads were beginning to form a pattern faint but distinct. The poison had been placed in the decanter before it reached the table, yet the arrangement of the guests and the sequence of serving were not quite straightforward. There was also the curious matter of the will and of Miss Fallow's nervous behavior. Back in her cozy parlor, she opened her notebook, a small, discreet volume bound in blue leather, and wrote, "Possible motives. Miss Fallow's jealousy or inheritance, dependent on cousin's generosity. Mrs. Hargreaves, resentment, control, or loyalty gone awry. Colonel Melchett, financial troubles, debt to Cotterill. Vicar or Mrs. Clement, unlikely, though may have observed something. Pritchard, means and opportunity, loyalty uncertain." She paused, tapping her pens thoughtfully, then she added one more line. "Poison prepared in kitchen or garden, who had access between 6 and 7 p.m. The answer, she suspected, would unravel the entire affair. For now, however, Miss Marple set down her pen and poured herself a modest glass of milk. Outside, the village lay quiet under the pale light of the moon, each cottage asleep beneath its thatched roof. Only the faint hoot of an owl disturbed the stillness. And somewhere in that sleeping village, she thought, the true murderer was also wide awake, waiting, perhaps, to see what would happen next. The following days brought a flurry of small revelations, as often happens when a crime disturbs the calm surface of village life. St. Mary Mead, usually content with discussions of weather, preserves, and the rector's sermons, now hummed with theories, whispers, and the peculiar satisfaction of those who find their quiet routines suddenly laced with intrigue. Miss Marple, for her part, went about her business serenely, her hat at its usual neat angle, her knitting bag tucked under one arm, but her eyes missed nothing. The pattern was forming, yet too many threads crossed one another in ways that did not quite fit. Every time she thought she glimpsed the truth, another piece would fall into place that contradicted it entirely. And then came the inquest. The inquest was held in the modest oak-panelled courtroom in Much Benham, the nearest town of any size. Miss Marple attended, naturally, though she sat quietly at the back. Her expression, one of mild curiosity rather than morbid interest. Lady Bantry appeared pale but composed, dressed entirely in black save, for a small pearl brooch at her throat. The eyes of the courtroom followed her as she took her seat, the picture of dignity under trial. Miss Marple noted the firm set of her mouth, the look, she thought, of a woman determined to endure humiliation with grace. Inspector Craddock gave his evidence first, clear and factual. The deceased, Mr. Edmund Cotterill, aged 46, had died of acute digitalis poisoning. The amount found in his system could not have been accidental. The source was traced to foxglove leaves from the Gossington Hall garden. The poisoned wine had been consumed at dinner, and the decanter contained clear traces of the drug. The coroner leaned forward. Was there any indication that the deceased had access to the poison himself? "None," said Craddock firmly. "The preparation requires some care. It was deliberately introduced." Then came the household staff, Pritchard, solemn and bewildered, the maid, pale and trembling, Mrs. Hargreaves, calm and precise. Her testimony drew murmurs from the crowd. "I was polishing the silver that afternoon," Mrs. Hargreaves explained evenly. "I noticed the decanter was slightly dull and wiped it with a cloth. It was later filled in the kitchen, but I did not see by whom. Pritchard generally attends to the wine." The coroner asked, "Did you see anyone else near the decanter?" She hesitated, a barely perceptible pause. "No one in particular, sir." Miss Marple's knitting needles, concealed discreetly in her bag, clicked once before she stilled them. A hesitation like that was seldom meaningless. When the inquest concluded, the coroner declared that there was sufficient cause to commit Lady Bantry for trial. The gasps that followed were audible. Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze steady on the front bench. It was all wrong, too neat, too pat. Someone, she thought, had been arranging the pieces just so. That afternoon, Colonel Melchett called upon Miss Marple, his face red and indignant. "Damn nonsense, the whole thing," he burst out. "Dolly Bantry, as innocent as you or I told Craddock as much, but he's all by the book, you know, won't see reason." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea. "You were there that evening, Colonel. Tell me, did anything seem amiss to you before Mr. Cotterill fell ill?" Melchett frowned, struggling to recall. "No, nothing at all." Cotterill was full of stories about India. Bit of a bore if you ask me. I suppose someone might have wanted to shut him up, but murder? Ridiculous. And yet, Miss Marple said gently, someone did precisely that. Melchett drained his tea. I can tell you one thing, Fallows didn't like him, thought he'd treat her shabbily. There was some talk about a business deal or inheritance. I didn't catch the details, but she was white as chalk when he keeled over. Miss Marple raised her brows. Indeed, and has she been in the village since? No, she cleared out the next day, went to London, I believe, said she couldn't bear the atmosphere of suspicion. Ha. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The guilty often find the air oppressive, so sometimes do the innocent. Melchett looked at her shrewdly. You think she's guilty, eh? I think, said Miss Marple slowly, that guilt is rarely so simple. Some people commit a crime with the best of motives, and others appear guilty only because they behave foolishly. But if Miss Fallows has gone to London, I dare say the police will soon know more about her circumstances. The next morning brought an unexpected piece of news, and one that stirred the village into fresh speculation. Miss Fallows had been found dead in her London flat. The verdict was suicide, an overdose of sleeping draught. In her room was discovered a letter addressed to the police, confessing to the murder of Mr. Cotterill and begging forgiveness. The newspapers were ecstatic. Society tragedy, second death in Gossington Hall case. Lady Bantry cleared by cousin's confession. Within hours, the village of St. Mary Mead returned, outwardly at least, to its former calm. The gossip turned sympathetic. Lady Bantry, though deeply shaken, was exonerated. But Miss Marple was not satisfied. She sat by her hearth that evening, the confession letter spread before her. Inspector Craddock had shown it to her privately, knowing her mind. The tone of the letter was oddly formal, detached, as though dictated rather than written in remorse. And there was another detail. It mentioned a quarrel between Miss Fallows and Cotterill about a sum of money owed. Yet Craddock's inquiries had found no record of debt between them. It did not fit, none of it did. The next day, Miss Marple went quietly to Gossington Hall once more. Lady Bantry, though relieved to be cleared, still seemed troubled. It's all over, Jane, she said faintly. They've found poor Diana's letter. I can hardly believe she was capable of such a thing. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes calm. Yes, very sad indeed. And yet, Dolly, don't you think it odd that she should have written such a convenient confession? Lady Bantry looked startled. Odd, well, perhaps, but she was emotional, you know, and she'd been drinking. Perhaps, said Miss Marple, but she was also clever. Clever people rarely choose the simplest way out unless someone helps them to. Lady Bantry stared. You mean she didn't write it herself? I mean, Miss Marple said gently, that the style is not hers. I once received a note from Miss Fallows thanking me for lending her a book. Her handwriting looped quite differently, and her choice of words was less precise. Someone imitated it rather well, but not perfectly. Lady Bantry gasped. Then who? That, said Miss Marple softly, is what I intend to find out. 2 evenings later, Miss Marple received a visitor, Mrs. Hargreaves. The woman entered the parlor with her usual calm efficiency, removing her gloves with neat movements. Her expression, however, betrayed tension. Miss Marple, she said quietly, I believe you have been asking questions. I ask questions of everyone, my dear, Miss Marple said, offering tea. It is a harmless occupation for an elderly lady. Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated, then sat. I must tell you something before the police draw the wrong conclusions. I found a letter among Mr. Cotterill's papers after his death. It was addressed to Miss Fallows, but I burned it. Foolish of me, I know, but it contained words that would have ruined her reputation. I thought I was being kind. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Kindness can be quite dangerous, Mrs. Hargreaves. May I ask what sort of words? Mrs. Hargreaves coloured faintly. Intimate ones. They'd been close. I didn't wish Lady Bantry's dinner party to become a scandal. I see, and no one else knew. No one. Miss Marple regarded her steadily. Then tell me, Mrs. Hargreaves, why did you wipe the decanter that afternoon? Surely polishing silver was the maid's task. The woman's hands trembled just slightly. Habit, I suppose. I can't abide fingerprints. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Of course, we all have our little habits. When Mrs. Hargreaves left, Miss Marple sat back, her eyes bright. There was fear beneath that composure, fear of discovery or of something worse. And the story of the burned letter had come too late, too conveniently. She took up her notebook once again. New observations. Confession possibly forged. Mrs. Hargreaves hid or destroyed letter from deceased. Motive, protection, or blackmail. Handwriting to be compared, Fallows, note from earlier. The pattern was changing. What had first seemed like a straightforward case of jealousy and greed now appeared to be something colder, calculated, and not at all centered on Miss Fallows. The young woman had been a pawn, not a culprit. And if Miss Marple was right, the true murderer was still very much alive. 2 days later, an incident occurred that confirmed her suspicions. Miss Marple was in her garden when Cherry, her maid, came rushing out breathlessly. "Oh, ma'am, you'll never guess. There's been another accident at Gossington Hall." Miss Marple's face remained calm, but her knitting slipped slightly from her fingers. "An accident, Cherry?" "Yes, ma'am, Pritchard the butler. They say he fell down the cellar steps, broke his neck, poor soul." Miss Marple stood very still. "Fell, or was pushed, I wonder?" Cherry blinked. "Oh, ma'am, you don't think?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "No, my dear, I think the murderer has begun to feel afraid." That evening, as dusk fell across the quiet village, Miss Marple sat once more at her writing desk. The pieces now lay before her, the poisoned decanter, the suspicious will, the false confession, and now a second convenient death. She knew, beyond doubt, that Lady Bantry had been framed, and that the person behind it was methodical, intelligent, and intimately familiar with the household routines. There remained only one thing to do, to lay the trap and wait for the guilty party to reveal themselves. Her expression was serene, her eyes shrewd. "People," murmured Miss Marple to herself, "will always do the same thing twice, if the first time went unpunished." And with that quiet thought, she set her plan in motion. The sun rose pale and uncertain over St. Mary Mead, casting long fingers of mist across the gardens and hedgerows. Inside Gossington Hall, where only days ago laughter had echoed through polished corridors, a stillness had settled. Yet beneath that calm veneer, the air was taut with expectation. Miss Marple sat by the library window, her knitting on her lap and a faint frown between her brows. For the first time in many years, she felt the familiar weight of an unsolved riddle pressing upon her thoughts. She had watched, listened, and quietly gathered threads of truth from the tapestry of gossip and lies, and at last, those threads were beginning to weave into a coherent pattern. She heard the sound of footsteps, brisk, decisive, and a moment later, Inspector Craddock entered. He looked weary but determined, his coat speckled from the morning's drizzle. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted, removing his hat. "I suppose you've heard the latest. The coroner's report confirms what we suspected. Verity was poisoned. Arsenic, administered slowly over several weeks. It wasn't suicide, it was murder." Miss Marple nodded once, her blue eyes unreadable. "Yes, Inspector, I rather thought it would be." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You thought it would be? You speak as if it were expected." "My dear Inspector," she said mildly, "one learns that people who seem to take their tea alone very seldom do so entirely without influence. I found the matter of Verity's little ailments, her headaches, her fatigue, oddly reminiscent of a case I once knew in Dorking. In that instance, too, the young woman's tonic was not nearly as innocent as it appeared." Craddock sighed and sank into a chair opposite her. "Then we've still the question of who. Lady Bantry's situation is precarious. The gossip in the village has reached fever pitch. Some even say she did it out of jealousy or pride." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "gossip is a dangerous creature, Inspector, like a cat. It seldom scratches the right person." She set her knitting aside and folded her hands. "If you'll permit me, I should like to make a few observations." "By all means," said Craddock, leaning forward. "Firstly," Miss Marple began, Consider the timing. Verity died on the very evening Lady Bantry announced she would be leaving for London. That timing suggests someone wished to ensure Lady Bantry's absence would look suspicious. Secondly, we must not forget the missing ledger, the one Verity kept for the household accounts. Money, I dare say, often tells its own story. Craddock frowned. You think the motive's financial? In part, said Miss Marple, but not entirely. I have spoken to Mrs. Price Ridley, who, as you know, has a most regrettable tendency to eavesdrop, and she let slip that Verity was overheard quarrelling with a man in the garden last week. She thought it was Major Marchmont, but Mrs. Price Ridley's eyesight is not what it was. I believe it was someone else. Craddock frowned deeper. Who then? Mr. Basil Fortescue, Miss Marple replied quietly. The inspector's head jerked up. Fortescue, the young man from the neighbouring estate, what reason would he have? Quite a good one, said Miss Marple softly. He was engaged to another young woman, a Miss Clara Donne, whose fortune was rather smaller than he had expected. I suspect Mr. Fortescue's interest in Verity was not of the sentimental kind. When Verity discovered certain irregularities in the household accounts, perhaps payments that should not have been made, she threatened to expose him, and so she had to be silenced. Craddock rubbed his chin. It would explain his nervousness during the interviews. He claimed to have been in Bath that evening. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, but Mrs. Harkness saw a motor car outside the Bantry gate just before 9 o'clock, with its lamps extinguished. She thought it looked like a Morris. Mr. Fortescue drives one, does he not? Craddock was silent for a long moment. We've no proof of that. No, but we soon shall, said Miss Marple, because I believe Mr. Fortescue was not alone that night. Craddock looked up sharply. Not alone. No, there is another player, one who knew how to turn suspicion away from herself, someone who understood Lady Bantry's pride and how easily it could be used against her. The inspector's eyes widened. You mean? Yes, said Miss Marple gravely, Mrs. Chilcot. The name hung in the air. She was Verity's closest companion in the house, Miss Marple continued. It was she who prepared the teas, she who managed the medicine cupboard, and she who, according to the maid, found the note by the bedside. Yet she has wept too easily and protested too much. Her loyalty to Lady Bantry has been theatrical rather than sincere. Craddock stood packing, but her motive. Miss Marple's gaze was distant. Resentment perhaps, envy, or self-preservation. Mrs. Chilcot was once in service at the Fortescue estate. She was dismissed under delicate circumstances. I dare say Mr. Fortescue has been paying her for her silence ever since. When Verity began prying into accounts, Mrs. Chilcot saw danger to them both. She conspired to remove the girl with Mr. Fortescue's aid and to let Lady Bantry bear the blame. Craddock let out a low whistle. That's quite a theory, Miss Marple, but how do we prove it? Miss Marple smiled faintly. We invite them both to tea. That afternoon, Gossington Hall's drawing-room was arranged precisely to Miss Marple's liking, with tea things gleaming and scones still warm. Lady Bantry sat composed but pale, while Colonel Melchett lingered near the hearth, his face grave. Mrs. Chilcot stood by the window, hands folded. And at the far end, Basil Fortescue entered, his expression one of polite bewilderment. Ah, Mr. Fortescue, Miss Marple greeted kindly. How good of you to come. I thought it would be so pleasant to gather everyone concerned, purely informally, of course. The young man glanced nervously at the inspector, who gave no sign. I have been considering poor Verity's last days, Miss Marple continued, pouring tea. It seems such a pity that so kind and cheerful a girl should have died in so distressing a way. You knew her well, did you not, Mr. Fortescue? He hesitated, slightly, only through Lady Bantry's household. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once. How curious. I was under the impression she had been visiting your house rather frequently. Mrs. Chilcot mentioned she once returned from the Fortescue estate in quite a state, said she was upset about some papers she had found. Mrs. Chilcot's hand trembled, spilling a drop of tea. I never said. Oh, but you did, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly. I'm quite sure you did. You see, I have a very good memory for things that seem unimportant at the time. Fortescue turned red. "This is outrageous. You've no right." "No right?" Miss Marple looked up, her eyes suddenly keen. "Oh, but truth, Mr. Fortescue, has a most inconvenient habit of revealing itself. You see, the ledger Verity kept, it was not lost at all. I found it hidden in the linen cupboard, wrapped in an old towel. It contained records of small but regular withdrawals, money unaccounted for, all directed to a Mrs. C, written in your hand." Mrs. Chilcot gasped, clutching the arm of the chair. "You see," Miss Marple went on, "Verity must have confronted you both. Perhaps she threatened to expose the theft. You persuaded her to drink the tonic, a little more bitter than usual that evening, perhaps, and then left the note to look like despair. It was quite clever, but cleverness, alas, is never quite enough." Craddock stepped forward. "I think that's quite enough, Miss Marple. Mr. Fortescue, Mrs. Chilcot, you'll both come with me." Basil Fortescue's face twisted. "It was her idea," he shouted, pointing at Mrs. Chilcot. "She said it was the only way. She mixed the arsenic." Mrs. Chilcot cried out, rising in fury. "Liar, you told me she'd ruin us both. You made me do it." The inspector's men moved in swiftly. The commotion subsided into silence. Lady Bantry sat rigid, one hand gripping her teacup. "Jane," she said softly, "you've saved me again." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh no, dear Dolly, I merely noticed what everyone else preferred not to see. Evil rarely hides in shadows, it hides in plain sight, behind good manners and afternoon tea." Outside, the church bells began to chime, their sound drifting through the mist. Justice, Miss Marple thought, was sometimes a delicate thing, quiet, almost polite. Yet in St. Mary Mead, it always found its way home. The following morning dawned brighter than any in recent days. A faint golden haze hung over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the hedgerows and glinting off the dew-speckled lawns. The storm of gossip that had so violently swept through the village was, for the first time in a fortnight, beginning to quiet. Even Mrs. Price Ridley was forced to concede that perhaps Lady Bantry had been very much misunderstood. At Gossington Hall, the drawing-room fire burned cheerfully, and Lady Bantry sat upon the sofa, dressed once again in her elegant lavender silk, though the lines around her mouth betrayed weariness. Opposite her sat Miss Marple, as placid as a porcelain figurine, her knitting balanced neatly in her lap. "My dear Jane," Lady Bantry said, "I scarcely know what to say. It seems absurd, all of it. Basil Fortescue and that dreadful woman plotting murder in my very house. I can hardly bear to think of it." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Evil seldom chooses appropriate drawing rooms, my dear. It prefers the comfort of familiar places, where no one would ever dream of looking for it." Lady Bantry sighed deeply. "Poor Verity, I can't help but feel responsible. She was so young, so full of spirit." "She was also rather too curious," Miss Marple replied gently. "But curiosity, after all, is not a sin. It is merely dangerous when directed toward those who have something to hide." Colonel Melchett entered then, looking both relieved and chastened. "Morning, Miss Marple, Lady Bantry." He gave a little cough before continuing. "Inspector Craddock's just come by to let us know the prisoners have confessed. Fortescue admitted to falsifying the accounts, needed money to pay gambling debts, apparently, and Chilcot supplied the poison. It's an ugly business." "Ugly, yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but tidy, and tidy endings are a rare blessing." Melchett rubbed the back of his neck. "It's a queer thing. If it hadn't been for you, Miss Marple, we might have had Lady Bantry before a magistrate. The evidence looked devilishly convincing." Lady Bantry gave a shiver. "Don't remind me, Colonel. I don't think I'll ever again trust a village whisper." "Oh, but you will," said Miss Marple with a smile. "You see, gossip is not wicked in itself. It is merely raw information, unrefined. The trick lies in knowing what is dross and what is truth. Most people never learn to tell the difference." The Colonel chuckled. "And you, Miss Marple, you've got a gift for it." Miss Marple resumed her knitting. "One learns a great deal in a small village. The patterns of human nature are rather like those in a piece of lace, endlessly varied, yet predictable when you know the stitch." There was a pause, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. At last, Lady Bantry said, "Jane, will people ever stop talking about it?" Miss Marple looked up, her eyes kind. They will, dear. In time, they will find another scandal, another curiosity, but you mustn't let that trouble you. You have weathered worse storms. Lady Bantry gave a small laugh. Yes, though never one that put me so nearly in the dock. Ah, Miss Marple said with a twinkle, but imagine what an admirable figure you would have cut in court. Calm, elegant, unflustered. You'd have won over the entire jury before luncheon. Lady Bantry chuckled despite herself. You do have the oddest sense of humor, Jane. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village. She passed the churchyard, where the headstones leaned like weary old men, and the post office, where Mrs. Hartnell was already recounting how she had always suspected something about that Fortescue boy. Miss Marple stopped to post a letter, exchanged a few polite words, and went on her way, her eyes missing nothing. At the green, she paused to watch a group of children playing at catching leaves that fluttered down from the oaks. There was laughter, bright and innocent, carried on the crisp air. Life, she thought, always resumed its rhythm after tragedy, as though goodness itself insisted on returning to balance. She passed the vicarage, where Reverend Clement was trimming the rose bushes, and he waved cheerfully. "Ah, Miss Marple, heroine of the hour," he called. "Oh, I do hope not," she replied with mock alarm. "Heroes are such inconvenient people, don't you think? Always expected to do something dramatic." He laughed. "Well, you've certainly done something, saved Lady Bantry's good name, and given us all a proper story for generations to come." Miss Marple smiled faintly and continued on. She turned into her own little garden at the end of the lane, the gate creaking softly behind her. Her house, with its ivy-clad walls and scent of lavender, seemed particularly peaceful that day. Inside, everything was as it should be. The kettle whistled on the hob, the lace curtains fluttered gently, and her cat dozed contentedly by the hearth. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, took up her tea, and allowed herself the smallest sigh of satisfaction. Yet even in her tranquility, her mind lingered on certain details, small, almost trivial things that had bothered her. The cup Verity had used, for instance, was one from Lady Bantry's private china cabinet, one that Mrs. Chilcot had fetched herself, and there had been the faint scent of bitter almonds lingering in the air long before the tonic had been poured. It was a small thing, perhaps, but Miss Marple never disregarded small things. Still, she reflected, the world was once again in order. The wicked were exposed, the innocent vindicated, and tea-time restored to its rightful serenity. That evening, Inspector Craddock came calling. He was not, Miss Marple observed, a man accustomed to paying social visits, yet there was a gentleness about his manner that bespoke gratitude. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said, standing awkwardly in her parlor, his hat turning nervously in his hands. "There's no doubt in my mind we'd never have got to the bottom of this without your help. Your sense of people, it's uncanny." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea. "Nonsense, my dear Inspector. It's merely that one grows accustomed to observing others. After all, in a small village, one must amuse oneself somehow, and there is nothing quite so fascinating as the study of human behavior." Craddock smiled faintly. "I suppose not, but tell me what gave it away, what made you certain about Chilcot and Fortescue?" Miss Marple leaned back, eyes half closed. It was something Mrs. Price Ridley said quite without meaning to. She remarked that Mrs. Chilcot had been seen polishing Lady Bantry's silver the very morning of Verity's death. That struck me as odd, since Mrs. Chilcot had complained of headaches for days. When people do something energetic on the day of a tragedy, it is often because they wish to be seen and remembered as doing something quite innocent. Craddock chuckled. "I'll keep that in mind." "You should," Miss Marple said gently. "Murderers are rarely strange creatures, Inspector. They are, almost always, perfectly ordinary people who make one very bad choice, and then another, to conceal the first." He nodded thoughtfully. "You've got a rare gift for understanding them." Miss Marple smiled. "Not understanding, my dear, observing. I simply watch what people do when they believe no one notices." As dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, a light mist began to curl along the lanes, and lamps winked to life in cottage windows. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer around her shoulders and sat once more by the fire. Lady Bantry had sent over a note, a brief, elegant thank you in her unmistakable slanting hand. "My dearest Jane, words will never suffice. You have saved my name, my home, and my faith in friendship. Always yours, Dolly." Miss Marple folded the note carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her keepsakes, pressed flowers, faded invitations, and the occasional newspaper clipping of curious incidents long past. She took a sip of her tea, smiling faintly. "Lady Bantry in the dock," she murmured to herself. What an absurd notion that was. The clock chimed softly in the hall. Outside, the wind stirred the garden, carrying with it the faint scent of autumn and the promise of another quiet evening in St. Mary Mead. And there, in her cosy parlour, Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly, her needles clicking once again, while the village that so often underestimated her slept peacefully, unaware that its calm depended, more often than not, on the gentle mind of the old lady with the knitting bag.